All right, I think we'll get started with some introductions and then people can just kind of trickle in as we get started here. Hi everyone, and welcome to PGTME's sixth annual Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Eden Ilmus, and I am the program coordinator of the Working Group on Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics, also known as PGTME. And our speakers will be introduced shortly. It's really hard to believe this is our sixth year of hosting this event, so thank you so much for joining us today. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics housed in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health and is funded in part by a gift from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. You can learn more about PGTME at the link to our webpage, which will be shared via the chat function. And the Lunchtime Lecture Series, or LLS as we like to call it, is our hallmark educational event, and it'll be continuing throughout the rest of this week. So please join us daily from 12 to 1:15 Eastern for free virtual sessions on pressing topics in the gene therapy space, featuring expert speakers and audience Q&A, and a link to the registration page for the rest of the LLS will also be shared in our chat. So we're super excited to kick off this week with an all PGTME panel. Ethics Explained. If you are unable to attend any of our talks, we'll be posting captioned recordings on our YouTube page once the week has concluded. And today's events will feature some brief introductions by our speakers, followed by a moderated discussion. We've also allowed at least 15 minutes for audience Q&A at the end, and we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A feature throughout the duration of the panel. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator and then hand the mic over to him. So Andrew McFadyen is the ethics lead for precision child health at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. Before that, he was the executive director of two patient advocacy organizations for patients and families with rare diseases. He's worked closely with governments and pharmaceutical companies to help ensure access to novel therapeutics for patients in need, as well as how to create equitable expanded access programs. His interest in rare diseases, novel therapeutics, and access to medicines began when his son Isaac was diagnosed with MPS 6. And so I'm going to hand it over to Andrew to take the discussion away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Aiden, and thank you, everybody. Welcome. We really appreciate you joining us during your lunch hour. This is the sixth Lunchtime Lecture Series, and it's been incredible every year. I'm honored to take part in day one here. Even more honored to have the panel that we have with us joining us today. So, Ethics Explained. What a daunting title for day one. And when that title came to me, it caused a lot of pause, a lot of thought as to what a panel like this could or should look like, etc. So let's begin with a really deceptively simple question. What is ethics? Now, at its core, ethics isn't sort of just a list of rules or a code that we consult when we're unsure what to do. It's sort of a way of thinking. It's a practice of asking, what is the right thing to do for this person in this moment, given what we know and what we don't know? It's about fairness. It's about responsibility. It's about compassion. It's about humility. It's about recognizing that our choices in science and in medicine ripple outward, touching individual lives, families, and entire communities. Now, in gene therapy, these ripples can be profound. This is a field that carries both extraordinary promise and extraordinary uncertainty. We're talking about interventions that not only aim to treat disease, but may alter its course entirely. And yet, as science races forward, we continue to have the ethical questions multiply, such as how do we make sure families understand what participation in a gene therapy trial really means? When new information arises years later, what do we owe our former patients? How do we balance hope with realism, innovation with humility? And who gets access, who gets left behind, and who decides what counts as a cure? These aren't just abstract debates. These are lived realities for clinicians, for researchers, for advocates, and patients alike. And to help us think through them, we're joined by three incredible individuals today whose work reflects ethics in action. Dr. Liza-Marie Johnson is a pediatric oncologist and bioethicist at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. I'm lucky that she's a frequent collaborator of mine. She works directly with families to ensure that consent and communication reflects the realities of both science and emotion. Patrick Moeschen is a longtime educator and muscular dystrophy advocate. He reminds us that the patient voice is not peripheral to ethics, it is ethics. And Dr. Marilyn Baffoe-Bonnie is a sociologist and bioethics researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. She challenges us how to look at how technology and inequality intertwine, shaping whose hopes are heard and whose, are overlooked. Over the next hour, we're going to move from theory to practice, from consent to communication, from clinical uncertainty to social responsibility, and from hope to humility. The goal here is not to define ethics once and for all, but to see how it's lived at the bedside, in the lab, and within the communities that we serve. So, to get us kicked off, welcome everybody. I think I'd like to start with Liza. You work every day with families that are facing sort of difficult choices about new and sometimes risky therapies. And when we think about gene therapy, where so much is unknown, how do you approach informed consent in this space? And what does understanding really mean when the science and the risks are still unfolding?
Such a wonderful question, Andrew. Thank you. And as an informed consent researcher, I could probably talk for 75 minutes and answer that question, but I will not. And recognizing not everyone loves it as much as I do. So I think we know that informed consent in other contexts is often suboptimal, that people can kind of come away with a poor understanding of a study purpose, the risks and benefits, sort of core concepts. And so I think, ensuring quality informed consent, part of it is we need to sort of train consenters better, thinking about the power of words and the power sort of language. I think it's important to remember that we think of informed consent in research contexts, but sometimes in clinical settings, like if you think about gene therapy for sickle cell disease, there's two FDA approved therapies, so that's a clinical consent, but it's still a very important decision. So just reminding people that words matter, ensuring sort of checking for understanding, recognizing sort of the pitfalls of therapeutic misconception or misestimation. I think, in my past life as an IRB chair, I would hear sometimes investigators, but my patient needs this therapy. And they would be talking about or a treatment, about a phase 1 study drug, right, that was dose finding and sort of. So if they're communicating with me as a peer about to want to know how are they communicating with families and sort of managing expectations. And then just sort of two more things. I think that um, one, we've seen patients come to our institution for a phase 1 and their kind of mind is maybe already made up. So even if you do a great informed consent, they have already sort of decided by getting on the airplane that what their goal is. So I think also thinking about how we teach the referring clinicians about communication with families about expectations and beliefs and values. And then I think it's not a conversation, it's conversations. And so thinking about what goals and values are and coming to know a family really well, and trying to sort of, you know, see if there's sort of any blind spots or if, you know what I mean, if they're thinking it's a cure all and it's sort of a phase 1, trying to think about how we gently have a conversation. Or, well, have you thought about if it doesn't work? It is a phase 1. We're just trying to see, this is one of the first in human. Have you thought about what if it doesn't work? Or what if there's what side effects would be unacceptable to you? So I think it's really partnering and shared decision making and tries to optimize informed consent. That was a lot. So
No, it's a
uh,
lot, but it's what we need to hear. And when you talk about that idea of sort of shared decision making, I sort of go back to, I think many people on the call know that my son has received gene therapy and was like one of the first, he was the first to receive the high dose of gene therapy in Italy. And thinking about informed consent, Isaac was 14 at the time. And one of the greatest informed consent that I've witnessed or have heard of or been a part of was for that gene therapy trial when the principal investigator came in and sat with Isaac I think on that first day for an hour and a half, sat right on his bed there, answering every single question that he had, going through things over and over. And then the next day he came back again and said, Isaac, we had a long, wonderful chat yesterday. Were there questions that arose after I left that you were thinking through? And they talked for another hour. He did that for 5 days straight. I understand that there are resource implications, etc. It's very difficult to do. But for us, understanding how important that informed consent was, I thought it was just, really, really wonderfully done. So that idea of shared decision making was there for that, and for us who had been part of raising the money for that gene therapy trial, it was even possible for us to give appropriate informed consent as parents when we, put so much into it. That's another question that you and I talk about a lot. But Patrick, I'd like to turn to you because you sort of have also lived on the other side of these conversations as being both a patient and an advocate for others that are navigating that rare disease space. So from your perspective, then this is a loaded question. What does ethical communication look like? How can researchers and clinicians share hope without drifting into hope and drifting into hype and make sure that that patient voice genuinely shapes the process?
So, well, thank you. And that is a loaded question. And thank you all for having me on the panel. And to those of you that are giving up your lunch hour to be with us, hopefully the conversation is not so bone dry that you're doing 16 other things right now while checking Slack, having lunch, and dealing with other stuff. So I want to say first that I do want to echo point both of you guys made about it's not a conversation, it's conversations, plural. But from the patient perspective, I want to add too that I often feel, even in this group of ethicists and wonderful people that we talk about, all the gene therapy stuff, I was drafted. Let me back up by saying the vast majority of the people that I interact with on a daily basis here in this space, you guys enlisted. So you're clinical researchers, you're passionate about policy of ethics, you're passionate about medical ethics, you're passionate about the clinical trial space and all the right, but you're also educated in that. All of us patients, we didn't enlist. We were drafted. And believe me, I am very, very, very happy that all of you exist, because then when there is possibility for hope and something comes up and we say this genetic trial, this, the landscape is fascinating. It's a wonderful time to be alive and living with a rare chronic condition right now, because there's so much hope for the future. But I think first and foremost, you have to remember that sitting in front of you, whether it be at the bedside, in the clinic, you have a family that is probably quite deer in the headlights. Even if the diagnosis was many years ago, it is difficult to, it's almost impossible for you to overstate the bridge, the width of that gap. Remember where you live in the land of all that you do in the medical field, and then you're talking to somebody that has probably a pretty deep knowledge of their rare condition, but all the other stuff in this landscape and sometimes mindscape of going through all the informed consent and all the ethical things that can be brought up. Remember, you're probably talking with a layman, so you have to frame that up as well. So I just wanted to make sure I made that point, that it's kind of like know your audience, right? And remember, none of us, you may have chosen this career, none of us chose to have a rare disease. So we've all been thrown into this bucket together. So what do we do, right? So first, I think we can agree, to me, ethical principles, it's the same, right? We all want to be, as patients, we want respect, we want transparency, we want collaboration, and we also want empathy. All of these wrap up into one big ball of communication. So to Andrew's point about a principal investigator coming in 5 days in a row, and how that's difficult, I would say if you're going to be in this world, you have to be ready to give as much as it takes for the patient and the family to feel comfortable in the decision making. I think it also is huge that Andrew did not say the investor came in and spoke to us and spoke to me, spoke directly to the patient. They're the ones that are going to be actually going through the whole thing. So it's not just family, although they play a big part, but we have to involve the patient directly, right? So I think the other thing is, in one area, the patient is definitely an expert. They are the expert on their own condition. And I believe that the, ethically sound communication acknowledges the patient's input. It respects their knowledge and maybe in some cases integrates their perspectives in the decision making. So I would say make sure the patient is still front and center in the conversation and get ready to have those conversations over a long period of time, as long as it takes. And remember your audience. So to echo Liza, that's an awful lot, and we certainly don't want to speak at you for 60 minutes, but hopefully we're seeding the field for some questions you may have, because we were talking about this panel last week and we said we would much rather have an open, honest discussion of what you guys in the audience want to know. So there's my
Yeah.
2 cents to begin.
That's great. It's a great 2 cents. I love that idea. We're all thrown into this bucket together. I love being in this bucket with you, Patrick.
Me too.
Absolutely.
It's a
That,
silver lining.
that idea of we've chosen this life, we've chosen this career, etc., and we've been educated over vast amounts of time over lots of different aspects of ethics, etc. I can tell you that when it came time for Isaac to be infused, all of that knowledge for me seemed to disappear. Like just being, I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. I was, intently listening to, the principal investigator and the team, and I'm still doing that now. Even, I do this work for other patients, other families, etc. You sort of revert back into that protective parent state as well. So it's vitally important, no matter the background that we're coming from, that we address that we make sure that the principal investigator is sort of speaking the appropriate language, looking after all of us, and making sure we all understand as we move forward. Because that was one thing that surprised me. Like, all of my perceived knowledge went out the door when it was time for Isaac.
And I think it's an important point, not to cut you off, but you became a dad, which first and
Yeah.
foremost, that's what you are, right? And you're a husband and a father, and you became a dad in that moment, and everything else went out the window. So you really have a unique perspective on both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
But I think it gives pause. I've spoken to so many medical professionals, and I'm glad they speak up to me. Like, I, am more intelligent than I probably am. Maybe I just put that forth, but there's the gap there. But at the end of the day, it's about the family and about what is actually about to happen. Because we're an awful long way from swallowing a Tylenol or taking an aspirin, right? We're talking about some really cutting edge, unbelievable, amazing stuff. And the silver lining, yes, is all the people on this call and all the people that are listening in from out there. I think constantly about how many people that are wonderful influences in my life that I would never have met if I did not have a rare disease. So that is what fills my bucket of what we're all involved in.
I love it. I mean, your reflections highlight how ethics lives not only in the decisions that are made in the clinic, but in the broader systems that sort of
Gotcha.
shape those encounters, right? Like, who's invited into the conversation, whose concerns get recognized, whose stories are heard. Now, Marilyn, your research kind of looks precisely at these larger contexts, and you're writing a book right now, which is we're going to get into at some point a little later, but you're looking at the cultural, the social, the structural dimensions of emerging biotechnologies and that sort of thing. From your vantage point, like, how do issues like equity, historical mistrust, social identity influence the ethical landscape of gene therapy? And again, that's like 3 loaded questions to start a panel.
Yes, but 3 very, very important questions. So I will try to hit all of the big 3. And I'll start with mistrust. And I think the first thing I'll do is maybe reframe it as trustworthiness, which I think you and Liza and Pat have already been touching on, as you all communicate about the burden of developing trust and communication, and that being on institutions and providers and not on patients or individuals living with these rare diseases or conditions. And so I think in my work, which specifically focuses on individuals living with sickle cell,
Mistrust doesn't necessarily come from fear of experimentation, but more so it's coming from decades of undertreatment, inequitable research funding, a pattern of being cared for in moments where there's therapeutic development, for example, but not necessarily continuously when they need care. And so something I think about a lot, this quote from work done by Ruha Benjamin, where a patient says to her, you know, I feel like I'm really wanted as a research participant, but not so much as a patient in the clinic. And I think that distinction between the healthcare system and the research system sometimes blur together, but ethically it really matters, not just because of things like therapeutic and curative misconception, but because many people, again, are feeling wanted in certain spaces, but not again as patients. And so that can all impact things like mistrust. I think about things regarding equity in terms of who is shaping or how is it being shaped, who is actually getting access to gene therapy, who can even imagine gene therapy as an option. And so we know right now that there are new payment models that are being developed in sickle cell specifically. But again, the sheer idea that a gene therapy could cost millions of dollars, I think sometimes sends a symbolic message about who gene therapy is really for, right? So it's not just that access is logistical, but there's really that moral component there. And so it's telling communities in certain parts of a community whether or not they're valued. We know that the burden of disease for sickle cell is greatest in resource-strained environments. And so sometimes it can feel dissonant to hear about gene therapy when families are fighting to get hydroxyurea. And so really that whole leap to gene therapy is feeling enormous. And then social identity is a really big one, and I won't talk so much about it right now because I think there's probably going to be more times that we can keep bringing it up. But I think in terms of thinking about approaching something like gene therapy from the perspective of social identity, that is really shaping whether or not it even feels desirable to an individual or to a family, because gene therapy and the decision to pursue it from like a sociological and ethical perspective can be shaped by family history, legacies of stigma, community belonging, what it means to an individual to feel part of that community, or in sickle cell, like a sickle cell warrior. It's not just about clinical metrics and things like that. So yeah, I think I'll stop there because again, I think I could go on and on and on about this, but I'm sure I'll keep bringing in sort of threads throughout the rest today.
But we want you to go on and on about it because it is all of these things that you are bringing up are vitally important. I got stuck on that idea of curative misconception. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I mean, I know it, I feel it, I live it, but tell us what does that mean? Like, how does that look like? And who perpetuates that misconception? All of these are not on any of the list of questions that I said I was going to ask you, but as it came up, those are all the things that went through my mind. And Liza and Patrick, please jump in as well for that. Like, what does that mean to you, and what does it look like, and how do we mitigate that? Holy smokes, that's 10 questions in one.
Yeah, so I guess I can start about sort of curative misconception, what that is, more textbook wise. So I think curative misconception comes from therapeutic misconception, where therapeutic misconception can sort of be misestimation, or hope or misunderstanding, with hope not necessarily being ethically questionable, but the other two having some concern. Curative misconception is the thought that participating in a clinical trial means that the outcome is to cure you or that you will be cured. And I think curative misconception can come from the use of cure language, especially in spaces where something is being tested, it's not necessarily approved, but also in approved spaces for gene therapies where there is not necessarily a guarantee that something will cure you. And then I think going back to really what I think about in my work is how the meaning of cure really differs across communities, within communities, dis depending on your vantage point of your lived experience with illness or your positioning as a provider. And there's a whole host of things that arise from the meaning of cure and how it's understood and how it's lived. And all of that can feed into curative misconception. But I'll let Liza and Pat also comment because I know that this is a topic that we all talk about a lot.
Liza, Pat?
Yeah, I can jump in. We have a study, we haven't published this data yet, but we asked about 60 parents, primarily mothers of children with sickle cell disease, to define cure. We sort of were talking about the potentially transformative therapies. There was a set that had really trouble articulating because it seemed like, such maybe a foreign or overwhelming concept. Some talked about not having to take medications all the time. For some, it was to live pain-free. For some, it was to not be stigmatized and to be like a normal child, and it just sort of shows kind of like in a sort of simple context, what it means to a parent and how vastly different answers those can be, much less sort of thinking about you're actually talking about it. I think that's why for sickle cell, we've been trying to say potentially transformative therapy because it can change sort of the course, of someone's life. I think that we were just having a debate about whether this patient should have gene therapy or a haplotransplant. And so the individual is a young adult with severe pulmonary hypertension. And so, like, transplant has been shown, like, the mechanism to sort of kind of stave that off and prevent it from progressing. But we don't actually know enough about gene therapy to see if sort of the mechanism and the rise in hemoglobin F will sort of have those same sort of benefits. So that's kind of that little bit uncertainty. So this patient does gene therapy and it's like not as effective, for his specific manifestation. Is he cured? And so I think really also asking patients, right? Because especially if to stay in sickle cell disease, people may still have chronic pain, right? Because they have some of their pain is from avascular necrosis, right? Or sort of end organ damage from the disease itself, and you don't sort of cure that. So I think asking, and then I think the sort of the last point I'll make, and I'll cede it to Patrick, is I think where does some of it come from? It sort of comes from us and how we sort of communicate. We've got a paper we're about to submit, kind of looking at end of life care, like for all comers. We're looking at actually everyone who died in the inpatient setting in a HEMOC unit over the course of 10 years. And the leukemia sort of cohort, those patients with leukemia seem to have more chemo, more sort of interventions, kind of more things, sort of as they, approach in their last week of their life. And I think for patients with solid tumors or brain tumors that are relapsed or refractory, it's like there's less good options. But in leukemia, it feels like it's always like, oh, we can try this other protocol or mix these chemos together. And I think we providers keep offering one more hope, or we present it like a treatment, not necessarily as a oh, this might cure you, without it's how you frame it, right? If you go back to behavioral economics, it's like, I think it's the framing of the clinicians that sort of can contribute to sort of this misconception around cure or benefit. Patrick?
Yeah, before Patrick jumps in there, it's like a really interesting point, that language that we need to sort of change how we're framing it. Is it possible, Liza, for us to even do that when you've got pharmaceutical companies putting out press releases about every single step that, every piece of data that comes out? There's a press release, hopeful, potentially curative, transformative, all of these sort of like hype words that are not directed at patients and families. And Pat, you can jump in on this too, because you and I have talked about this before. But it's directed at the investors. It's directed at the like continue that flow, continue to stay with us. But it's the patients and families that hear it, and they're calling us and saying, "We hear there's a cure for X, Y, or Z." Like, how do you balance what we're saying and the work that we're doing with that external pressure from companies and other researchers that are out there? Or can
Liza,
we?
do you want to jump in and answer that directly first?
Yeah, I think that we have to be careful because it's subliminally it gets into the clinician or the researcher's minds too, not just the families and sort of the framing. And I think that what I learned from a colleague many years ago in palliative care is, best case, and even in ethics, right? When there's uncertainty, best case, worst case, most likely. And so I think that when having these conversations, I mean, it's hard if it's like you're the first one, but now, if you've treated 20 patients or there's a small sort of cohort or what is sort of known based on other things about helping people understand what to sort of expect, or sort of trying to frame it that way instead of these numbers on a consent form or this thick amount of pages. I mean, we're interviewing people who've been through gene therapy, kind of trying to understand gaps and blind spots. And a lot of them have said, like, they explained mucositis to me. Like, they explained it sort of really well, but I couldn't fathom it. It was so much worse, and I was experiencing it than I ever expected. And so, in that sense, how do we sort of improve that lived reality? And maybe it's sort of having not just clinicians, but having like navigators, parents who've sort of been through gene therapy with a child or a family member, sort of training these people who want to give back to sort of help, navigate or help people know what to expect, or, gets back to conversations. It's like an ongoing thing. Like, okay, I know we talked about this in the consent, but like this is what really you might expect over the next 7 to 10 days, and sort of in the moment and in the context, trying to sort of help people understand sort of an element of a big research study. Go ahead,
Awesome.
Patrick.
I think
I-
too, again, I'm going to come back to the framing of language, but also the gap, right? So my mind is going in 65 million different directions. I'm going to try not to ramble. I think, first of all, again, when you talk about the vast majority of the population, they do not have any awareness of rare disease unless it touches their lives. So when they start to read articles, even investor articles about some specific medicine for, in my case, muscular dystrophy, genetic therapy, CRISPR, things like that, I think it goes over people's heads if they don't understand how difficult the condition is. To be honest, I've spoken to many people over the years about my exact type of muscular dystrophy, which is limb-girdle, and they kind of get this glazed over look, like two things. One, why is this taking so long to cure? And two, why is this so difficult? I don't understand. You told me you're missing a protein in your muscles. They know how to make the protein in the lab. What's the problem? So when I start talking about AAVs and all these different things and the mechanism and the immunosuppression system, they're glazed over because their societal knowledge of cure is what we learned in school. Polio has a vaccine. Smallpox has a vaccine. Penicillin is a vaccine. So all these things have been, quote, cured, right? We get our vaccinations when we're kids. And it's going to stop these things from happening. That's got nothing really to do with a rare genetic condition. But in the world, they see it as, well, they cured that. What I don't understand what the problem is. Why? What do you mean there's nothing you can do? That's the other thing. They're shocked. There's no pill for muscular dystrophy. Why don't you just swallow the protein? So there's such a rudimentary lack of the knowledge base that we all have in this world that I don't want to say it needs to be dumbed down, but to your point, it even goes out to the reporters. I get rageful when I read these regular articles, even in like USA Today and Pedestrian things, that are saying cure, cure, cure. I'm like, well, first of all, I don't know that I need to be fixed, right? Medically, there's things that you can fix inside my body. However, I've lived with my disease for 40 years. I've used a power wheelchair for 15. I am fixed because the power wheelchair is the treatment, right? Language matters. I correct everyone that will listen when they say, oh, he's in a wheelchair. I'm not. I use a wheelchair. I don't sleep in this thing. I don't take a shower in this thing. I'm not wheelchair bound or in a wheelchair, but I correct medical professionals all the time. Well, he's in a wheelchair. Yeah, for this appointment, but that is a treatment, right? So to me, that's a cure for the fact that I can't walk. I can now get around, right? But it's always, do you need to be fixed? And then we can again pivot and talk about, what does that mean? Okay, you can cure muscular dystrophy. Ask 5 people what that means. It means different things, right? Stop the progression. I hear that a lot. Liza, I love your point about polling families. I'm going to steal that idea if it doesn't already exist in the literature, because that's the other problem, right? It's like asking somebody to define the word good. Ice cream is good. What does that mean? It means different things for every single person that tastes it. So what does cure mean? Likely it's going to mean something different for everybody that is asked. There's my ramble for you and my soapbox.
It's
Thank you
it's a
for
good
coming to
ramble.
my TED Talk.
We, I go to any of your TED Talks, I promise you. We have a mounting list of questions that are coming in.
I
Some of
saw
them are
that. Yeah.
related to the conversation, etc. I want to get to them, and I will get to them. But one thing that you said, you could see me sort of hold my heart there, Patrick, was that idea of, do I need to be fixed? Like, and that really hit home. And I remember vividly driving from the hospital for sick children. I was in dad mode, driving from sick kids home, and Isaac's in the back seat, in the middle seat on his sort of high chair, and we're heading home. And we just got some of the great mouse data on MPS6 for that clinical trial that we'd been funding for so long. And I was talking to him about it, saying how amazing this was and excited I was, and I just can't believe it, and blah blah blah. And I'm just rambling on and on like I tend to do. And I looked in the rearview mirror, and Isaac is crying, like just tears. And I thought it was tears of joy. And I'm like, well, what's up, bud? And he said, Dad, I'm scared. What happens if they cure me and I don't have MPS6 anymore? Then we're not going to have our adventures together any longer. And I was just like, oh my gosh. I
That
mean, I
aha
mean,
moment.
yeah, it was an aha moment for me. Like as you said, like been in this space for so long, and it was even my language. And it sort of goes to Stefan's question there about how we phrase things when we're talking to families to prevent that therapeutic misconception. And for us, that was sort of the word around here. We're researching for your cure, bud. I'm flipping burgers this weekend at the local Rona to raise, X number of dollars. It was probably like 40, to find your cure. And so I think that's vitally important. And Stefan, I think we're sort of getting to the end of that. The language that we're using needs to be updated, or even more realistic sounding, or realistic for patients and families, that we're not finding a cure, that we're sort of or we're not going directly to that cure or fixing people. We need to be more realistic about that. I'd like to, does anybody want to jump in on that before long? But yeah, Patrick, you grabbed my heart there when you said that. Like, what does it mean to be fixed? And that's an entire panel that we need to do.
No, well, yeah, and hopefully I just taking notes on this because we always spill out afterwards and we say, wait, what just happened? But to Stefan's question, how should we phrase things when talking with families to prevent therapeutic misconception? I think it's impossible to prevent it completely, but again, it's knowing the gap and having conversations over a longer period of time, and not saying, maybe not even saying words like cure or even vastly improved. It has to be, this is what we medically think is going to happen. Like you said, worst case, best case, most likely case. Uh, it's ongoing. And again, knowing that your audience probably really has no idea what a cure is, besides, if I take an aspirin, maybe my headache will go away. I had a very old, uh, an old family care physician that was practicing for so long that he took care of my grandparents when they were very old, my parents when they were adults, me, and just retired with my children. I said, Doc, you've taken care of 4 generations of my family, which is amazing. And I said, you've been in family practice for so long when it's a dying breed of medicine. And he said, you have to understand something. 80% of, and I'll never forget this, he said, 80% of what I see in my office on the first line defense, it's going to go away on its own. He said, so I have to kind of guide people along. I don't deal with the dark, rare disease and things like that. But it made me think, again, the vast majority of the general public has no idea what we're talking about. To them, cure is, I'll take the vaccine or I get an aspirin. So I can't overstate that enough. You have to remember who you're talking with, and what their idea of a cure is. And the fact that we are sitting out here with diseases that quite possibly will never be completely cured. Um, but there's a difference between that and fixing me.
Well, Marilyn, you're kind of focusing in on this idea of being cured. You've got a book project on the go, and you're looking at sort of what it means to be cured from the perspective of individuals with sickle cell disease who've undergone cell and gene therapy. Uh, what do you have to add here to this? I mean, this is such a rich topic. This is sort of ethics, explain what to do and what not to do. Can you highlight a little bit more from the work that you're doing right now?
Sure, yes. And I will try to just highlight because 70,000 words I have cannot be read in this moment. So I'll
I
try to
can't wait for that
keep
book
it
to come out.
succinct.
Are you doing an audiobook version?
You know what? I don't know. Maybe we can poll the audience. Do you like my voice enough to hear me read all of those
Absolutely.
chapters
Absolutely.
and parts? But maybe that's a good idea. I haven't thought of that. But I think actually the initial question that you asked me regarding social identity links back to this concept of cures. We've been talking about it, especially when I think about the interviews that I had with individuals who had already undergone cell and gene therapy and what being primed to think of cell and gene therapy as a cure before they went into transplant, how that complicated their experiences they had received after they had received their therapies. And I think one major piece that came out was this impact on their identity, especially for those who can continue to have pain or lingering complications that um, couldn't be uh, fixed, as we're saying, by cell and gene therapy. And one major point that individuals talked about was, am I still part of the sickle cell disease community? Or am I no longer part of the community, or I feel uncomfortable engaging with the community because I'm no longer, quote unquote, in the trenches with individuals? But then on the other side, there were individuals who said, this memory of living with sickle cell disease, that cannot and never will go away, even though the physical manifestations of the disease, like the disease trajectory, has changed. And for those who felt that they were either still part of the community or were not part of the community, this sort of handoff after gene therapy, many of them felt like was not where they needed it to be in terms of support. So on the clinical side, some individuals said, I continue to have pain. I went to my hospital. That was not where I got gene therapy. The providers thought it was a cure, and so were confused when I was asking for pain medication. When people decide to enroll in clinical trials, it's not just because they wish to have reduced pain or improve their clinical system in clinical complications in some point. It can also be to get away from the stigma, mistreatment that they're experiencing in the healthcare system. So then on the other end, when they've then continued to have the same misbelief and disbelief, it's almost as if, well, why did I go through this process if you're still not going to believe me when I'm still having pain and complications, because a provider thinks that cure is whatever it means to the provider. And then I think on the other hand, sort of again, reintegrating in this way after cell and gene therapy and trying to figure out who's going to help me understand who I am now that my illness is different, that I feel differently towards my illness. I think these are all things that I'm thinking about in my next project, which is sort of called Care After Cure. How are we really delivering care after we've declared somebody cured? And I think it really has to be thought of as a continuum as we're developing these therapies and implementing these therapies. It can't just sort of be, oh, well, you took the therapy, we're done. It's a continuous process. Cure is temporal, illness is temporal.
That's amazing. There's a question in there. When will the book be released?
That's a great question. Hopefully next year. It's currently under review. Yeah. But
I'd
the
like to review it. I want to be one of those
oh,
reviewers. It sounds amazing.
absolutely. I'm always looking for anybody who wants to read it beforehand and give me feedback. I love feedback. The title right now is, unless my editor makes me change it, is Sickle Cells to Supercells, the Alluring Genetic Cure for Sickle Cell Disease.
I love it. And I'll tell you, just to post some levity on this, if you don't want to do the audiobook, I'm happy to record it for you.
I mean, you do
You
have a
have such good
soothing
hair.
voice, Patrick.
People tell me I have a face for radio.
It'll be perfect. There's a great comment. Go ahead, Liza. Yeah, because I'm going to go to you right now. But so go ahead, hit it.
I wanted to circle back to something that Patrick said a couple of times about, these are people don't have like the scientific expertise necessarily. And I think, in my research on informed consent, sort of the importance of lay language, we had a study where we had this two-step process in a brochure, and then we sort of did some interviews about the process. And I remember these like parents sort of saying that you don't, one parent said, she would say something that the average person probably wouldn't know, and then she would define it. She'd be like, which means da 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 da. And then another parent said, you don't want to have to ask so many questions because you don't want to seem dumb. And so I
Yep.
think a lot of what we know about sort of informed consent is that we vomit a lot of information at people, not in an organized manner. We ask them if they have any questions. They're trying to figure out exactly how to articulate the question, and we start talking again. I mean, that's sort of what the data generally kind of show. And so I think just really the importance of reframing it, maybe with definitions, think some people are more visual kind of learners, but it's like we need to teach people to speak in just more straightforward and basic sort of language that someone can understand, and being sure to kind of define things for people, because people don't want to, I mean, some people will, but some people will just smile and nod, right? And it's
Well,
also like yeah.
no, I was going to say, I'm so glad you said that because it's extremely intimidating, right? It's extremely intimidating, even if you think the person on the other side of the table is very educated and knowledgeable, they're intimidated as hell by listening to you. And also, to recall about the drafted and listed too, not everybody that has been diagnosed with a rare disease in the family, it can handle it. So you also have that whole entire level of, well, this is great, but I'm also coping with how I'm going to do 54 things today and I still have to work. Like, it's all the stress of everyday normal life on top of this. So Liza, I am so glad to hear you say that because I think it is extremely important.
Well, it touches on two of the questions that are in the chat right now. And one is more a comment, and that's for you, Liza. Jordana is saying that community representatives on the inside, vitally important. She's the head of community at a company where there are sponsors of a gene therapy trial on a rare pediatric brain disease. And her son was one of the first people to receive that to gene therapy patient in 1998. And she says patient family representatives are critical in IND protocol, IRB, REB communications, consent, patient messaging, etc. And that helps us with that language piece. It helps us with that. How do we know if we're connecting with patients and families, et cetera? And if you've seen that in your work, of course. Also, I will point out your work. You do so much. You're somebody that I know that is always like, I have this paper that I haven't submitted for publication yet. In like the hundreds, it's just remarkable the amount of work that you do and you have ready to go. So, comment on that.
That I need a clone to help me get the papers out. No, um, we, but we had this again still, and we're gonna have a bunch of our papers on our sickle cell stuff coming out. Hopefully in January 26th, we're working on a bunch. But similarly, a parent, or I think it was a patient, said, you should involve sickle cell patients often identify or call themselves warriors. So the quote is sort of, some people may have heard me say it before. It's like, you should involve a warrior early because you don't want to plan an entire clinical trial and then no warrior wants to enroll on it. So I think to Jordana's point, sort of actives early on. And then I think I'm always trying to be a little bit mindful of the high advocacy patient or parent too. Not every patient has the sort of, or family has the bandwidth to put things on and sort of be kind of like the, I don't know, have the megaphone, right? And so being considerate that their views may not be representative of an entire disease community, and sort of trying to get the cross-sectional, the family in the clinic, trying to sort of reach out and sort of get a broad sort of, a broader sense of people living with a rare disease.
Yeah, and that idea of like, it's a story, it's not the story, and it's a collection of stories that we need. It's a large book of short stories or long stories, as the case may be, in order to get a broader picture of what's taking place within a community. And I'm highly cognizant of that at Sick Kids, that people come to me and say, hey, you're a dad, can you be the patient voice on this. And I'm often like, it's patient voices, and I'm not sure that, just my voice is going to make up for everything. So we need to make sure that we have a vast selection of patient voices there. Patrick, you answered, you typed an answer to Lauren. Shout out, Lauren. Nice to see you. Lauren was in my MHSc bioethics master's program. She's incredible, wonderful ethicist here in Canada, so represent Canada as well. And she talked about that piece that hit home for me as well, talking about you enlisted and we were drafted, and you chose to enter this field and we didn't, type thing. And it really had a profound impact on her. And I know you typed the question in there, but she says, I'm wondering if you and others, of course, can comment on the principle of humility and how and if you see it as a necessary skill for folks engaging in this work. And I didn't want that to go unanswered by the panel here, this idea of humility and the impact that it can have on patients and families. So Patrick, you want to start that off, and then we'll send it to the rest of the family. And so hello, Lauren.
So, okay, yeah, and Lauren obviously just seriously scored some extra credit there. Unless Andrew forced you to come today. In that case, I'm very sorry, but I'm glad you're still listening. I mean, humility, I wrote it, so I won't overstate the point. Humility is everywhere. It has to be everywhere, inside and outside of our work. I think it's every waking moment of every day that we have conversations with other people. We have to think about it, because outside of the medical world and outside of the rare disease world, every single person on this planet functions on a different level. And I think the first thing you have to do when you enter into a conversation with anybody is think about that. Everyone is functioning on a different level. And then, you read the room and you adjust and you can start to communicate. I've had a lot of people in my life tell me that, I'm a good listener. And it's easy to talk to me. And why is this? And all these years I taught school and the kids and this, it's simply that. I try to reverse the roles and think, I have no idea what else this person is dealing with. I don't know what their gaps of knowledge are, or my gaps of knowledge. So I approach almost every situation with humility. I think it's vastly important. But Marilyn, Liza, Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I can jump in. I like to think of humility as sort of the counter hegemonic logic to cure, or to hype, and the hype of cure. I like to think of flourishing as the counter to cure, right? I think, or to the hype of cure. Um, I think that we're in a really, really exciting time for scientific development, for gene therapy development. But I think part of that excitement can get lost, and it can get sort of inflated or muddled when we forget about the lived experiences of individuals before, during, and after engagement with these technologies. And I think from a scientific perspective, humility um, looks like everything that my co-panelists have been talking about in terms of how we communicate what's actually happening, who we get involved to communicate what is happening. And I think that is incredibly necessary, especially when we read media articles. Like Pat, you said, it's cure, cure, cure everywhere. We get texts constantly talking about development. But again, I think humility forces us to really think about what it is going to be like for patients who are going through these therapies, what their lives are going to be like afterwards. Similarly, right, when we think about being fixed, as you brought up earlier, right, I like to think more in my work, less so about cure and much more so about flourishing. And what does it mean for an individual to say that they are flourishing in the presence or in the absence of access to these technologies? Because we know that not everybody is going to be able to access them, not just because of economic considerations, but because of eligibility concerns. You can enroll in a gene therapy clinical trial and not mobilize enough stem cells in the case of sickle cell disease, and then your hopes are dashed. And so I think all of those sort of concepts work together, and it's really about a balance of finding a way to center the individual throughout the process, and not sort of letting these larger excitements diminish that deep experience.
Liza, anything on humility?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you think of, to use someone was sort of an extreme lack of humility, if someone was like might be a swear word that rhymes with donkey. Like you never say that they have humility, right? You say like and so I think, why is humility important? I think it fosters trustworthiness. And I think we're kind of in an era where we're dealing with increasing medical mistrust, or it's decentralized health information. People are are tending to overvalue information they get from maybe a rare disease Facebook group, maybe something, a lived experience on TikTok. And so having humility to sort of say, well, these are sort of kind of the things that I sort of don't know, or, having humility allows people to maybe not be dismissive when people sort of do ask like this, maybe a question about something they saw online or express a worry or concern. I mean, I think that the reality is not everyone is a great communicator. There are, people that are brilliant researchers and like but they come out of the lab, right? They're translational and they're also PIs and they also have patients and they do consent. So I think it's also why we sort of need in communication about sort of these like intensive, novel, potentially burdensome, but potentially transformative kind of therapies. But I think also without humility, I think if you worry about people without good options being more willing to tolerate a lack of humility, I think the public trust can be undermined if we're too cavalier and we're sort of overpromise and are sort of not considerate of the needs, sort of the greater sort of people consuming the public healthcare space. That makes
I
sense.
love it. I love it. I'm going to take a quick step. Humility to me, I guess, in the position that I'm in now is the understanding that there's always more to learn, that we don't know everything, that we need to be listening, that we need to understand all of the perspectives of the individuals that we come across, keeping sort of an open ear on panels like this, listening to all of you, but also going through the questions and understanding what still needs to be known out there. All of that, I guess, for a parent as well, if I take that hat off and put my dad hat on, I think the greatest humility for me is remembering how precious every second is that I have, together with Isaac, that there is, a difficult road ahead, but that being in the here and in the now is vitally important. I think wrapping all of that up into what we do that brings that sense of humility that we can then share with patients and families as much as we possibly can in the work that we do. Shifting gears a little bit, but not really. In the chat right now, there's some questions that are intertwined, and it's about that idea of fundraising. And listen, I understand. I sit at the one of the earliest fundraisers for gene therapy research with my organization that we'd done. Um, how how do we ensure that there is still, I'm trying to just wrap up all of these questions here. How do we ensure that that funding landscape in rare diseases is enhanced so that it's not always patients and families on the ground, doing the work? How do we protect that relationship between PIs that patients have funded and clinician scientists, and make sure that that informed consent is still there? I mean, I still look back, Liza, on was I adequately able to provide informed consent for Isaac if need arose, because I'd spent all of that time and energy raising money. You and I are dealing with two novel programs right now where there are sometimes organizations that raise money and it's for N of one or N of fews. How do you appropriately, connect with that? And also, how do we deal with PIs who have received funding from patient groups and feel the need to report publicly about how transformative their work has been, and again balance that with the realities that are on the ground. So I think that's about four questions all wrapped into about 10 that I've posed to you, but hit on anything that you've heard there, please.
I guess I can share some stories. I think about the kind of ethical kind of principle of sort of justice and sort of thinking about sort of equity and access. I practice in Memphis, Tennessee, and we do offer transformative therapies for pediatric sickle cell patients, really up to age 22 or 23. So if you are an adult patient with sickle cell disease and you're interested in pursuing one of those, you have to go to Vanderbilt, right? So even though it's FDA and clinically approved, that for many of our patients, that is an insurmountable barrier, like financial and logistical burden it places on them. So I'm just sort of always kind of like being mindful about, in a society that's becoming kind of increasingly polarized, at least in the United States, with haves and have-nots, potential sort of considerations. I was, at a meeting and I heard two stories I'll sort of share with the sort of group in terms of framing. One was a person who does personalized NFU research and had a new appointment, a new consult with a family, and the family arrived with their venture capital fund manager, sort of expecting that they would figure out how they would finance this a therapy for this, individual child. And sort of think about, so are we sort of saying that people who have that degree of financial wealth should have access to these gene therapies? That's a question that we should sort of think about the implications of. And then at that same meeting, someone shared a story about a family of theirs who went for a consult at a center, right, that does those sorts of things. And the person said to this mother, well, it would be about $2.5 million to develop this genetic therapy for your child's condition. So if you have $2.5 million, let me know, and then my lab would be able to start working on it. And so this parent of a child with an ultra rare disease heard that if she couldn't raise $2.5 million, that she had this belief that she was implicit in her son's or daughter's poor outcome, right? That she would sort of bear some responsibility for sort of not like, unturning every stone in the interest of their child's health. And this is for phase 1 first in human intervention that we don't sort of even know if it would work. So I think to the access about the role of money in personalized gene therapy or just gene therapy in general, I think we have to sort of remember sort of, kind of equity, justice, ensuring that certain people aren't disproportionately favored, and also thinking about how we communicate so that someone doesn't send their family into financial ruin
Yeah.
because of hope and hype.
Right. Right. Anybody else want to touch on that? I mean, I think I've been tossing back and forth with you, Liza. I'm working on a paper and a framework about whether patients or families should be able to personally pay or fund for novel therapeutics or high cost drugs or N of one, N of few. If the answer is it's ethically permissible in a publicly funded health system, how do we protect equity? How do we make sure that we move forward for all? How do we make sure that those that can't are still voices that are heard? How do we make sure that we don't sort of prioritize the voice of one group or individual that can raise that capital, raise that fund? I don't know what any of those answers are. As the paper continues to sort of work, it like goes back and forth. It's how difficult this is. So we're going to talk more about that, as Aidan's saying in the chat there, about the economic implications, etc., of these types of interventions later on in the week. We've got a really wonderful week ahead of us. I know we only have a few minutes and need to wrap up, but there's still a few questions here that I would like to sort of try and get to. Rafa's here. Hey, Rafa, and you may be the last voice on this, although there's a couple of questions in here, but Rafa says, I hear the panel calling for clear language, precise nomenclature and definitions, and to use great care and precision when discussing possible outcomes of gene therapy research. And he says, and we all know this is a soapbox for Rafael Escandon if you've seen his writings, if you've been on panels with him, if you've seen him on panels, he talks about this a lot. And his question is, Which stakeholders can be most influential in encouraging precision and restraint, and to Marilyn's point, humility in language? How can they influence in a non-dismissive manner without coming across as a huge pessimist slash buzzkill?
I'm happy to start. So I think one, I think everyone here and sort of the vantage points we represent are critical to are critical to developing who can sort of address these concerns. So that's bioethicists, social scientists, clinicians with ethics orientations, patients, family members, right? I think it's really a group effort, because I think what we don't want, which often happens, is one voice or one sort of vantage point or perspective is leading conversations. And so I think it really, really, really is a collective effort. And then I've actually forgotten what I was going to answer, but I need to reread the question. But there was something else I was going to say, so I will circle back and let someone else jump in while I reread the question.
Awesome. Well, they're all loaded questions. None of these are on the list that we'd prepared or talked about, but we knew this was going to be an organic conversation. And I love that. Jordana, I see your comment over there about my paper and the framework, and you'd love to talk. I'd love to talk with you. We need a lot of perspectives on this, and I can't wait to get to it. So reach out to me after this, andrew.mcfadyen@sickkids.ca. Anybody else?
I remembered.
Okay. Okay.
Start working
Go
again.
back. Yeah, you can have it.
Yes, it was actually the last point of your question, Rafa. So about not coming off as a huge buzzkill or a pessimist, and linking it sort of back to the first part of your question. And I think something that links, or how humility is sort of linked in all of this, is that sometimes I always wonder why we just don't call things what they are. And so I did a review of how cell and gene therapy are described in hemoglobinopathy peer-reviewed literature with some of my colleagues a couple years ago. And we found that cure has often historically been used to describe these, but there's also something we call curefemisms, where papers will write disease reversal or free of disease, and then not define what that means either. And something we talked a lot about is sometimes it is cell and gene therapy. It's because whether it's cure, whether it's transformation, those things can be qualified, right? Transformation can transform your life in a positive way, can transform your life in a very negative way. Cure has a positive intonation, but it's so loaded. And so I think that sometimes the best way is just directly saying what it is, as everyone's saying, what we don't know, what it is not, using plain language to describe it. And I think that in and of itself doesn't have a sentiment attached to it, or is not necessarily qualified. But I think oftentimes the shorthands that we reach for, that is the thing that then becomes emotionally laden, or sort of convoluted and not clear.
I'm glad you remembered your answer to that. It was amazing. Liza, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, as Marilyn was speaking, I was just thinking, it gets back to that shared decision-making aspect and informed consent conversations being about like relational. It's like, why would someone not want to do this? And like something I think a lot about sort of sickle cell disease and how we can improve communication. And we just have this web-based tool is like, I think there's probably a couple of like, variables. It's like, well, how well do you perceive your disease is controlled, right? So if it's like your perception is like things are pretty good versus things are not good, and then like what is your risk tolerance, right, for some of the side effects or for uncertainty. And so if I think my disease is relatively well controlled and my risk tolerance is pretty low or things for uncertain, then I'm probably like going to look at it in a different way than if I think my quality of life is terrible and I'm like a risk taker, right? And so I think thinking about how we can sort of understand people's positionality regards to that. And then I think there's certain things like contextual features, right? Like, is now the right time, for not that gene therapy for sickle cell is elective, but it's like a little bit more elective than in some other disorders. Um, is now the right time? Can I put my life on hold for 8 months? Or, my mother is sick and been in the hospital, so I can't do it right now. So if we could sort of think of a way to sort of triangulate and then sort of understand people's values and then bring around sort of the reality about why someone might not do it, knowing what they know about their life and their values, I don't think you have to be like a buzz killer, you can be a realist.
That's awesome. And you know what? I want to sort of really quickly, we only have 2 minutes, 3 minutes here. I really, really quickly get to Joanna's comment there. She's said that she's heard that sentiment shared by others about ASO and N of 1 options for parents. And parents are told by other parents who've received such treatments for their kiddos that they must be ready to give up everything. And Liza, at your institution, you're working on a really incredible advanced therapeutics pathway. I know at Sick Kids, and I see some of my Sick Kids colleagues on the line here who are instrumental in a new advanced therapeutics pathway that's taking place. And we're not doing these in silos. We're doing these collaboratively. This isn't a sort of a competitive space for us. It's about trying to ensure equity of access for as many people and patients as they can, so that, to Joanna's point, parents don't have to give up everything for it. And Liza, our institutions are connecting together on shared vision, on shared pathways, on shared understandings of how we can do this together. Do you want to quickly try and capture that in like 1 minute, or did I capture it enough? But we recognize, Joanna, that this is the perception out there, and we want to make sure that we're working to change that with these really novel programs that we've got up and going. And again, not in competition, but in collaboration.
No, I think you summed it up. We're trying to both sort of think about what are the frameworks to deliver these in sort of an ethically informed way that meets of a diverse set of families, you know what I mean, living with these conditions, who may be sort of like hearing all the hope and hype, and sort of wondering if it's right for them, or, how do we communicate as we sort of potentially evaluate patients and families for gene therapies, particularly N of few.
Amazing. Okay, I think we need to wrap. It's 1:13. We're closing for 1:15. First and foremost, you guys are amazing, and I love hosting panels about this topic. But to have such expertise and such great humans involved is really wonderful. I've got to wrap up a piece here first, but I see Aiden's jumped on the line. Is there things that we need to say that I don't have planned in my closing here? Aiden, you can have the floor, and then I'll take the mic back and say thank you to everybody.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I just want to thank you guys all as our speakers for such a great discussion today, and also thank all of the attendees for their thoughtful questions. And then plug tomorrow's panel, Evidence and Approval in the Rare Disease Space. A registration link has been shared in the chat. Just on behalf of all of PGTME, thank you to everyone who's attended and participated and helped put the webinar together. And then
Awesome.
back over to Andrew to close us out.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I mean, I think we have to go back to that opening question. What is ethics? And I think that we've done a pretty good job of having a conversation about some of that and previewing some of it that will take place throughout the rest of the week with that incredible lineup that we have there. But today we've sort of seen that ethics isn't just sort of a checklist or a constraint. It's a compass. It's a compass that helps us find direction when science moves faster than certainty does. It's something that lives in conversations between clinicians and families. It lives in the courage of patient advocates like Patrick, who tell their stories. And it lives in the scholars who ask us to look beyond the lab toward the world that these innovations are going to shape. So it's one thread that's run throughout the discussion. It's connection. If there's one thing that we've seen, it's the connection between doctor, between patient, between science and society, between promise and responsibility. And gene therapy challenges us to keep those connections at the center of every discovery. So to our panelists, thank you so much. And to all of you, thank you for engaging in the ongoing work of understanding, of empathy, and ethical reflection. And as we've heard here today, humility as well. So signing off, thank you so much. Looking forward to the rest of the week, and we'll talk to everybody before long.
Thank you all, and I've just put your emails in the chat for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aiden. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.